Welcome to Agile in Toronto at night, a Badass Agile show. This is the place where you go behind the scenes and into the minds of the most compelling Agile and business leaders of this great city. My next guest has been studying and facilitating the human side of innovation, change, and growth. She's an explorer, experimenter, researcher, consultant, teacher, and writer who pulls insights from across disciplines and fields to bring us the truth about sustainable change. The table's just about ready, so why don't you come on over and join me in welcoming our guest, Catarina Von Maydell. Catarina, great to meet you.
It's great to meet you, Chris. Thanks so much for having me on your show.
Thanks for coming. Come on in. Grab a seat. You got a drink going?
I've got a drink going.
What do you got?
And I'm enjoying the lovely Toronto evening. I have an herbal tea.
That's what we call it now?
That's an iced herbal tea. That'll make me very, very relaxed.
Sure. It doesn't look like tea, but you know what? Whatever. Here we go. Cheers to you.
Cheers to you.
So, the strange thing is that I'm an Agile person. You're an Agile person, but you're not really an Agile person. So I am dying to know more about what you do, because in a way, you're not an Agile person, and yet you are. We kind of want the same things.
Absolutely, yes. So you, as I understand it, tend to work more in the IT environment, and it sounds a bit like the entertainment environment as well. While I'm working mostly, or have worked mostly, in the business community and the entrepreneurial community. However, I've also been in the education environment for the last little while as well. And the way that I teach is actually really, I'm trying to use a number of different approaches that are quite different than traditional teaching. So I'm trying to use an agile approach where there's sort of an iterative building process. I also try to introduce systems thinking and a range of other ways of thinking. And the reason I'm doing that is it allows me then to go back to clients and work with clients in a different way. So it's still an agile approach with clients that I work with, where we're very much sort of, it's not, the projects are rarely as formal as in IT environments, but there's always sort of this iterative learning, capturing what you've learned, redirecting based on what you've learned. So the agile work is actually a little bit different, but the mindset and the approaches are quite similar.
Okay, good. So for reference, I actually do work primarily outside of IT, and it's my preference to, because I'm trying to spread agility to non-IT concerns. So I do a lot of work with startups. I do a lot of work with small organizations. I do a lot of work within large organizations in HR, marketing, sales, legal.
Fantastic.
To bring the agile mindset just about everywhere, because I feel like in software we've got it, and in software people already want it. Everywhere else it represents perhaps more invasive change.
Yeah, it depends on the culture.
It does. That's a good point.
Yeah.
So tell me about what you're working on now.
So I'm actually in a bit of a transition at the moment. I've been teaching at the university level. I taught in China at a master's level for UK universities. And most recently I've been teaching in Toronto at the college level. And I was also working on my PhD. I'm not going to finish the PhD, but I'm still working on the research. And I'm at the point now where I'm trying to get that published in a variety of different ways. So it's sort of now I'm trying to test some of the ideas that I've developed over the last few years. And what I was doing, the reason I was starting my PhD is I wanted to sort of understand what was I actually doing in the past, because I seem to have stumbled upon Agile and systems thinking, and I mean, I don't label myself with any of these things because I'm not properly trained in any of these disciplines, and that's why I say I sort of stumbled into this way of working. And with the variety of clients I've worked with, whether it was an accelerator program that I built a number of years ago, where York University studied my results, our results. I had an amazing team of people that I was working with, so it was our results. And we were getting $72 of return on every taxpayer dollar we were spending. York University found that basically there was no comparable organization, no comparable results anywhere else in the world. And I'm curious what's been happening over the last 10 years or so with that. And then when I was teaching in China, the students that I was teaching, and again it was I and one or two other teachers that we were teaching at the master's level, they were preparing to to study in the UK at a master's level. And each year our students set records and were accepted to higher quality universities. And those marks were adjudicated by the professors. So those are sort of the programs where I've had other third parties measure the results of my work. But there's many other times where I've worked with clients where it worked out really well, but I really didn't fully understand what I was doing. So that's really what my research has been about, is really to try to figure out what was I doing, how do I replicate it, and how can it be scaled. And that's the part that I'm now trying to figure out how to do.
Wow. So there's a lot to unpack there, but let me try to summarize it in a way that I'm interested in, if you don't mind, from a selfish perspective.
Perfect.
If you're in the motorcycle game or the race car game or something, there's the drawing the diagrams, then there's the engineering, the design, the building, and then there's the actual going fast. So you have the side where you are figuring this out as you go. You mentioned you kind of didn't really know why certain things work, but you were getting big results, the $72 per every dollar invested. And then there's the academic side, which is trying to figure out what you just did so that you can teach it to other people. Which part's most exciting for you?
The human part. And I think that's really where we're lacking. And when I say we, I mean pretty well the business world writ large. There's a lot of talk about behavior change management. But what I realized that I was doing, and I definitely had intuitions about it, but it wasn't really based on scientific evidence. So I was doing everything intuitively. The teams that I was working with, we always did sort of things intuitively. We were very experimental. We were very agile. We were always iterating. But the one thing that I think that's unique that I bring to the table is the way that I look at behavior change, because when I look at behavior change, when most people look at behavior change, they're looking at it as a cognitive process. And most people recognize now that yes, emotions play a part in it, but I take it even deeper, and this is why I wanted to do the research, because it sort of goes, what I'm starting to recognize is it actually flies in the face of some pretty established science, but there's actually a very large and solid body of science that focuses on the nervous system rather than the brain. And that's sort of intuitively what I've been working on, is how do we help people align their nervous system so they're amped up enough that they really are competitive and sort of chomping at the bit to go, or to use your race car analogy, they've got their engines revved, but not so high that they aren't able to collaborate, that they aren't able to work with other people, or that they go into some sort of threat response. And when you've worked with entrepreneurs, you are an entrepreneur, so you know that sense that at times things can get pretty scary. And the reality is, in any major project, any competitive environment, you're always walking that fine line of how amped up do we need to be without crossing the line of getting into fear or some other debilitating emotion. And words like fear and debilitating are strong words. So, realistically, most of us don't necessarily get into the true fear or the true debilitation, but our brains don't work as effectively as possible if we're not conscious of what our nervous system is doing.
Okay, so again, a bunch to unpack there, but if I had to, well, I'm interested in the play. So getting it back to teams, because ultimately you do all this research and you do all this teaching. The end game is to bring it to benefit small organizations, large organizations. You want to make it repeatable, and it sounds like you want to make it scalable, and scalable means it also can't burn people out. It can't blow people up.
Exactly, yeah.
So you said you're interested in the human side. What have you learned that's, in your mind, practical? So in trying to explain how you get $72 of return for every dollar of investment, what have you found out so far? Is there anything that you know for sure is table stakes?
There's quite a bit I've learned based on the research I was doing in the PhD. Let me answer the question in a slightly different way, because it's hard for me to actually answer the scientific side or what I've actually learned. You're not asking me about the science, I know that. But it's hard for me to answer that question directly the way you've just asked it, just because I'll go down a bunch of rabbit holes, basically, because I'm still pretty engrossed in the research. When I work with clients, and I'm thinking of one group that I worked with in particular, there were cross-cultural issues, there were political issues writ large, there were inter-office political, like interpersonal political issues, so political issues of many types. And what I did with them is we did individual coaching with the people that were involved in the project, as well as I was doing facilitation with them. So we were always focused on the outcome, the goal that they wanted to achieve. And we kept iterating and saying, how do you get closer to that? So my job wasn't to come in as an expert. My job was to come in and help them ask better questions, to help them to listen better, to help them hear things they didn't necessarily want to hear better, or things that they were not willing to listen to. And there's a variety of reasons why all of us sort of have closed ears to some things. And you know, again, that's sort of a bit of a nervous system thing where we're trying to protect our identities, we're trying to protect our belief system, we're trying to protect what we believe is the right way of doing things, in quotation marks. So the work that I was doing overtly was very much facilitation and there were structured facilitation processes, but what I was doing with them was helping them to become much more comfortable with being challenged. So there's a term that I'm sure you've heard many times, the entrepreneurial mindset. And I define it a bit differently than most people do, because I define it as the ability to really be open to things we don't necessarily want to hear, and then also to be able to do this iteration. So in the innovation world, Agile is sort of the exploration process. How do we understand the situation better based on what's available to us now? How do we experiment and try different things to see what works? And then how do we commercialize it? How do we actually make it viable and scalable, or whatever is needed at that time? And then you iterate that process. So that's basically what I was doing with the team, is that we were sort of trying things, and then we come back and sort of explore what worked, what didn't work, how do you feel about it? And we had those conversations one-on-one as well as in the group. So does that sort of answer your question in terms of what I do?
Yeah, for sure, in terms of what you do. What I'm interested in is, if you are now facing an organization that wants to hire you, and they're saying, listen, we're very interested in that 72-to-1 ratio. Who wouldn't be, right? Who's not interested in that?
Yeah.
And when large companies want to disrupt, they tend to want to take on the attitudes and behaviors of entrepreneurs. But large organizations attract and reinforce certain kinds of behaviors that could be contrary to exactly that. So here, the challenge is, how do you superimpose, or maybe that's the wrong word, but how do you encourage your coach, what you call the entrepreneurial mindset, into a much larger segment of the population?
There's multiple layers to that. And first, the question is, what's the appetite within the organization? What's the appetite within the culture? And what are the risk factors for the different people at different levels in the organization? And when we're dealing with larger organizations, the politics is a big deal, as you know. So that's sort of the first assessment, is where's the real appetite and who's willing to actually take the risks to do this. There's ways of doing this iterative process in a larger organization without really sticking your neck out, but at some point in time, the team and the individuals will sort of start separating from the corporate culture. So there's a bit of a catch-22 there, and the way that I look at what the job of Agile people is, or people who want to act with agility, there's actually two layers that we need to do. Number one is we need to build the culture, not just within organizations, but we actually need to foster a culture of change writ large. And so this idea of creating agile change within larger organizations is an education process. And what's really cool is there's a lot of senior executives, from what I'm hearing, there's a lot of senior executives who are increasingly open to doing agile. But the problem is their power base sort of holds them back from being able to do that agility. So we're not yet at that point where real mass agile adoption can really happen in large companies, but we're definitely moving towards that. So the place where I think true agile can happen right now is it tends to be in smaller organizations. And it's not so much the size of the organization that's important, it's really what's the motivating factor. And unfortunately, I think pain still has, like if you really want to do true agile work, there's a lot of people who genuinely want to do it, but if their pain threshold, if their pain motivation if there isn't enough pain to motivate them, they're ultimately not really going to push to the point where they're truly agile in the way that they think and act. There's always going to be sort of legacy culture in terms of what they have to do, how they have to report to their bosses. That's going to help them, that's going to hold them back. So there's sort of a two-pronged answer that I'm giving you. Is number one, we collectively, as anybody who understands agile, systems thinking, design thinking, I mean, there's lots of different disciplines that are sort of trying to move towards the same thing. So we have to recognize that we need to keep educating, keep showing where the value is, keep demonstrating business metrics, hard and soft, sustainability of those metrics. That's sort of the cultural change, the larger cultural change that we have to keep doing. And then with the smaller organizations, it's really a question of what are they willing and able to do. And my job isn't to come in and say, okay, you need to hit these metrics. It really is, I don't know if this is really such a great analogy, but it's the only analogy I seem to be able to come up with, is think about somebody in high school who's really good as a musician or really good as an athlete, or somebody who's got a lot of promise in something. And they need to go through this repetitive learning cycle. They need to have mentors, they need to have coaches, and it's this repetitive process, sort of the Montessori approach, where people need to go into self-discovery and they need to be supported in self-discovery. I'm speaking about it from the business perspective, where I'm working with business teams that need to change how they operate. In the IT world, I think it would be a little bit different, because your listeners will definitely be coming from the IT world. So it can't be quite as nebulous as the environments that I tend to work in. But it really is this iterative, what did you discover? What are you curious about? Where do you want to go next? What are you willing to try? And it's my job to challenge them or to hold them back, depending on if they're too ambitious or not ambitious enough, and to help them sort of calibrate that with their comfort levels, trying to sort of get them to that right level of challenge.
Got it. Thank you for that. Here's a question for you. If you spend a lot of time teaching, I presume, young people at the perhaps graduate level of business school, and you're preparing them to go out into a world of management or executive leadership, anywhere in that spectrum. And essentially, if I heard you correctly, you're saying that be prepared for some pain, because this kind of agility doesn't exist systematically yet. It's not culturally everywhere. So no matter whether you go to a big org or a small org, it's going to hurt. There's going to be some pushback. There's going to be some failures. Is there any skill that you can give them, or you mentioned you're on the human side, the human pillar. Is there any preparatory work that they can do to get ready for that career? Any sort of skills that they need to master to weather that storm?
So I said that I'm interested in the human side, but I also bring the business facilitation, a deep business understanding. I started my career in the international capital markets, working internationally. I've worked in a range of different business environments, so I also come as a business person, not just with a human interest. But where I think I differentiate myself relative to other people is on the human side. To answer the question specifically that you're asking, resilience, and I mean that's sort of an overused word, and I actually define resilience a little bit differently. So if we talk about resilience from an academic perspective, it's very sort of responsive and not proactive. If we talk about grit, There's a bit more proactive, but it's still sort of more focused on tenacity. And I think there's very proactive things that we can do, which is everything focuses on how well do we learn. And so to me, resilience is not just how much can we withstand whatever challenges we face and the setbacks that we face and the frustrations that we face. That's absolutely part of resilience. But it's also the ability to really observe and to really learn. Because some of the most successful entrepreneurs are the ones, they often don't even know that they're doing it, but they have an unbelievable level of awareness of what's actually happening. And it tends to be very intuitive, where they're picking up signals that most other people are not aware of. And then they're synthesizing those signals that they're noticing so that they can act on it. Like that's sort of, they're doing a very intuitive exploration process of discovering and learning and understanding. And that's something I think very few of us have learned. I think those of us that do that very well come from backgrounds that really fostered it. I think it is absolutely a skill that can be learned, but it's something that I see a lot of people haven't done enough of. And I think there's a lot of cultural reasons. I don't think it's a reflection on any individual. I think it's very much a reflection of culture. And so the ability to truly learn, but learning not in the sense of opening a textbook and memorizing, or even applying knowledge from a textbook. It's really, how can you be truly curious about something? How can you really try to see multiple perspectives? And how can you really, in setbacks, in negative situations or disappointing situations, as well as when you have a success, don't just be excited that you had a success, go back and analyze it. So it's this idea of the Agile retrospective, but at a much deeper and much more meaningful level. Retrospective is, when I hear a lot of people talk about coaches and their frustration with retrospectives, it tends to be very superficial, and that's not really learning. That's just sort of capturing activities. But it's not looking at, why did this happen? Why did I do what I did? Why did I not do what I did? Why did that person do or not do what they did? Why did that result happen instead of the result that we expected, right? And it's really digging down with true curiosity to figure out what did happen and what didn't happen, and how do we replicate more of what we want.
That's fascinating. I'll tell you why. Because you mentioned that you have the human side, but there's also the balance of the business side. Everything you just mentioned seems to me is more the human side. You talk about intuition.
Absolutely.
And you talk about digging deep around your reasons why things worked, or the reason why things failed, or you failed to show up. Those are really human things that I'd argue are really hard to teach.
Very hard to teach, but very possible.
Can you give an example of, you mentioned intuition first, so I'm going to ask you, can you give an example of something that really good leaders, in your words, do in terms of intuitive cues that they're able to pick up on?
Oh, that's a good question.
I try to ask lots of those. How's that herbal tea going down, by the way?
Very well, thank you. I think I need some vodka in it now.
I was going to say, it looks like scotch.
I think I need something.
So yeah, let me just say that one again, because I got to get the tongue out of my mouth sometimes. But you mentioned that there are certain things that excellent leaders can intuit. They're very perceptive. Can you give one example of something that a well-conditioned leader can pick up on that the average either beginner or just the average person may not have been trained to catch?
I'll actually give a different example than a leadership one, because it's things that people will be really familiar with. When we talk about the superstar poker players, the guys that are on their world championship circuit, a lot of what they're doing is extremely intuitive. But what's interesting about intuition is absolutely something that can be learned. When I was doing my research, my academic research, there's actually 5 sort of distinct disciplines of intuition that I came across. And all of them sort of have an expert level of intuition. But then there's also a body wisdom intuition as well. And let me come back to that one in just a second. So intuition is actually something that's quite well researched, and it's still, we don't have any answers yet around intuition, but there is quite a bit of research around it. It's not a woo-woo thing. So when you look at FBI profilers, when you look at hostage negotiators, not that I've ever talked to anybody who does that, but I mean, I've done a fair amount of reading around how they work. And if you look at these championship poker players, their whole job is to read their opponents and make very significant decisions, in some cases life and death decisions, in some cases really high stakes decisions, based on their intuition. So intuition is, on the expertise side, when people talk about business intuition, usually what they're talking about is expertise in terms of business. You know, do you have enough formal learning? Do you have enough experiential learning? Do you have broad enough experiential learning? Have you actually processed that information in a way that's meaningful so you can actually act on it? And a lot of what that is pattern recognition, that you're building up a database in your mind of being able to recognize patterns. And there's a lot of research around that shows that we don't need a lot of information to make significant decisions. We just need to know what the right factors are to look at. And that's part of really highly skilled pattern recognition. So that would be a big part of it. But then there's another part to it, which connects to the experiential and the expertise piece, but it's what I call body wisdom, and there's other people use different words for it. But it's really learning to listen to the signals that your body is sending. And it really, you know, we often think of the signals our body sends are emotions, but in reality, our emotions are actually tip of the iceberg, and there's many, many, many more signals that we have access to. And if we learn to start really this emotional fluency or this physiological fluency, you know, really learning to pick up on those signals and understanding what they mean, we actually have access, and there's again quite a bit of research over the last 40 or 50 years, this is not new research, where they actually talk about emotion as information, and they're not talking about the emotions like happy, sad, they're talking about basically physiological signals, the signals that our body generates based on our awareness of what's around us. And that also can really be learned, and there's really fascinating research that comes from neuroscience and the study of the nervous system. There's really fascinating research on how that works, and I'm happy to use some big words because I like the words so much, but I'll let you ask the question and figure out if that's interesting to you.
Sure. Let's take one step back first. And you said that there was cultural resistance to adapting or incorporating some of this stuff, and this is what I was wondering if this is what you meant. When you mention this stuff, the stuff that you said, everyone thinks it's woo-woo, but it's not woo-woo. Is that the cultural resistance you're talking about? That people just don't want to spend time here because it's uncomfortable, different, and not as empirical?
The resistance can be really obvious in terms of if somebody that we don't like is speaking, we have a tendency not to listen or not to listen as carefully. If somebody we really are impressed by, we tend to listen and read much more into what they're saying than maybe they intend to. So there's resistance in terms of what our identities are, how we see ourselves relative to other people, how we want others to see us. Those are the identity pieces. There's also resistance based on what we believe. You know, if I believe the sky is green and I fundamentally, unquestionably believe that, doesn't matter what you're going to tell me, the sky will be green to me. So that's one type of resistance. But in terms of developing body wisdom, there's a lot of resistance to it because it's really hard, but once you get it, it's really easy and it's unbelievably powerful.
So does this help leaders, fledgling leaders, teammates communicate with one another and I hate using the word empathize because it's so overused, but to really gel with one another, is this an important ingredient of building high-performing teams and high-performing organizations?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Yes.
Got
Full
it.
stop.
Here's what's interesting about you is that at some point you had to get lit up about this. And some might assume it's, well, if I got really great results for one company and now I'm laser focused on replicating it. But that's got to be really hard to do. What is it? Do you remember the moment when you decided that this was how you were going to contribute to the world? This is what you wanted to do?
I do. but it took me a long time to admit it. So the culture I come from has a lot of trauma in it. And through my lifetime, for a variety of reasons, I've actually been doing this research pretty well since I was a teenager. But it was sort of something that I didn't realize had any valid application outside of culture community. But when I kept having these experiences where I was able to outperform people in many, many different places, and it doesn't mean I haven't made lots of mistakes and, things I wish I could do over again. But I really, when I get the combinations right, I really truly outperform people, and my teams can outperform people fairly significantly. But I just kept thinking it was sort of luck, and eventually I started realizing, no, there really is something different that I'm doing. And when I did that, I was doing it was sort of a marketing course, like how to build a consulting business. And I really did not want to create a mission statement for myself. I was kicking and screaming the whole way. And I basically was told I'm not going to be able to finish the course if I don't do it. And that's sort of when I made the commitment that my mission statement was going to be facilitating conscious thought, facilitating conscious action. And that was loosely 20 years ago. But it still took me at least another 10 years until I really had the confidence that there is something really relevant and valid. And I think my personal growth curve through this is actually a reflection of society. We're hearing over the last maybe 5 years or so, resilience is sort of a mainstream word. And over the last 10 or 15 years, I think there was a survey that was done about 10 years ago by Fortune magazine or something like that, where they said of the Fortune 500 company CEOs, something like 60% of them do meditation. That was at least 10 years ago. It could have been longer. And I would bet that there's probably many executive team members in the Fortune 500 and many companies. Any high-performance person has meditation of one type or another in their daily practice or their regular practice. So there's a lot of things that have happened in the last, let's say, 10 years that make it much more acceptable to talk about these things. So to dovetail or to sort of go back to what you were saying, there was a lot of resistance that this is really woo-woo. There still is a lot of resistance about bringing emotions into work. I remember having a discussion with a friend of mine a few years ago where she said, I don't want to deal with my employees' emotions, or, whoever she was talking about. And my response was, it's not that you need to be a psychotherapist, it's just a matter of becoming more aware of it and accommodating them. It's not about not making them do their work. I mean, they're there to do a job, and if they don't do their job, then it's a problem. But if we really want the best from our teams, everybody has to come most of the time ready and able to do the best work that they possibly can. So that means showing up as whole people. Again, you don't show up and show every part of yourself, but it also means that you're not going to be forced to hide any part of yourself. Mm-hmm. If you're having a bad day, that, of course you need to manage yourself, but there are going to be times where people need to cut you slack and support you, just like you need to support other people on your team. So it's really building this high-performance team where you can trust yourself and trust the people around you, and that the system is fair and transparent. So I think there's a much greater acceptance of that now, but I still think there's a way to go for people to actually become comfortable with that and to actually understand what that means.
So if I had to go and tell somebody what I learned today, which is an exercise I do with myself every night, from this conversation, I'd say a couple things that were all in that last segment. The first one is, the way I usually frame it is, there are no agile problems, only human problems. So everything that we bemoan about the process of trying to get teams to perform, the process of trying to figure out how to, as you say, commercialize our stuff, our ideas, all of the challenges are people challenges. So if we're not good at listening, understanding, intuiting, and solving in a way that's not too bossy, you know what I mean? Like, it really is a collaborative process. If we're not good at that at some level, we're just not going to get the performance. That's part one. The other thing that you said that's so important, because in the Forge, where I teach my little philosophy, if you will, there's a little school I have, if you like, and what we teach in there is vision, we teach meditation, we teach breath work, we teach resilience.
Brilliant.
Among other things. Now, one of the things that you said was that, I put my vision down, but it took me 10 years or so to really believe it. If I had one piece of advice for entrepreneurs or people just looking to really make a dent in the world, it's as an entrepreneur, you have to be patient with exactly that. You will never get any cues from anybody that you're on the right track. The only person who has to believe is you, and if you don't, nobody else in the world will.
100% agree. Yeah.
So let me ask you this. In a way, you're in the business and team performance business. I hate to lump you into that bucket, but effectively that's the outcome or the objective of what you do. You want to make a certain segment of business better. What pisses you off about our industry?
It's a good question. And it's not just our industry, not just the Agile industry, but it's a societal problem where even though we're making some pretty big headway in terms of being open to the human side, we still default, as a society, we'll still default to mechanical processes, right? And the reality is change only happens at the speed of humans. And if you're not empowering the humans, and everybody has a responsibility, it's not just a leader's responsibility, it's everybody's responsibility to step up. So it's a frustration more than being pissed off about something. It's a frustration that we're so close to getting there, but we haven't yet crossed that threshold where this is the norm of how we operate. To really look at how do we get humans to work together much more effectively? How do we work as individuals much more effectively? And this is a huge learning curve. And it really is, if I had to sort of put it all in a nutshell, I would say it's collaborative learning. Because the learning, as I talked about earlier on, is so important. It's really, true reflection, true curiosity, really opening yourself up to a grief cycle of recognizing, I screwed up, I dropped the ball. And it's not that we always are making mistakes, but it's easy to look at the wins. And for many people, it's hard to be honest about the mistakes, right? And we're not going to be able to acknowledge those mistakes if we're not comfortable with the grief cycle. So all of those things are really important for learning. We have to be really good learning individually, but really true agility, true organizational change, true social change only comes from collaborative learning. And that's really what Agile is about, is collaborative learning. That's what entrepreneurship is really about, is collaborative learning.
You must be so popular. I mean, when you go on LinkedIn or you go on YouTube, this is all people are talking about, is scripts don't work. You can't recite scripts and get good at leading teams or get good at hitting home runs. The people side has to be there. And you say we're so close and yet so far. Is this resonating with people? Are you seeing this, taking off, like people are thumbs up everywhere?
Starting to. It's really, part of it is I've had to hone my message and really try to figure out what people are interested in, and that's sort of my learning curve that I've been going through. But there also is an openness to it. And, as much as I wish there was no COVID, no pandemic, and as much as I really feel deep empathy for the people who are personally affected by it in one way or another, the gift of COVID is it actually is accelerating some of these conversations. Yeah, and as much as I really wish we didn't have to go through the violence of the Black Lives Matter, the reality is this has been going on for 50 plus years, and there's been a lot of resistance to social change, but we're now at the cusp where we have to deal with it, and now we have to do this collaborative learning. It doesn't matter which front we talk about, we're really at this really fascinating cusp. I don't think COVID is the only trigger for all of this, but COVID seems to have accelerated a lot of these discussions. So we're really at an interesting point. So to answer your question, 2 years ago, there were many people who were open to it, but it was a very select type of person. Now it's becoming, it's much easier to have these conversations, and people are much more genuinely curious. So
That's good.
there are some really interesting, fascinating things that are happening.
Speaking about interesting, everyone that I've spoken to in the past few weeks has said the same thing, that COVID in a way was a blessing. Most of us, at least people I know, don't know anyone that's been directly impacted, not in a disaster, tragedy kind of way, but everyone's been affected. And I think that it takes sometimes watershed moments to really turn the corner, with the kind of corner where you notice the elbow, like things are different now that we've gone around the bend. And I think you're so right that maybe now is the time when some of these things will make more sense, when people finally start to get it.
Yeah. And going back to this cultural change, it doesn't matter if we're talking about agility cultural change, Black Lives Matter cultural change, or any of the other fronts that we need to push on. We are at a cusp. And yes, it is an opening, but there's many people who want to take advantage of it for their own personal gain. And the emphasis, I would say, is now for those of us that are truly interested in agile, agility, systems thinking, cultural change in any environment, we now really have to step up. We really have to, the positive change will only happen if we really step up and make those changes.
I agree. You could do what you do anywhere. Why Toronto? What's special about this city for you?
I love Toronto. I moved here, I've sort of lived in several places in the world. I moved here about 20 years ago and enjoyed it. But then I was gone for about 5 years. I've been back in Toronto for 5 years, but I was gone for 5 years. I was in China and Germany. And when I came back, it really felt to me like Toronto had grown. I mean, the analogy that I kept having was I felt like when I left 10 years ago, Toronto was the gangly teenager. And when I came back 5 years ago, it had actually blossomed into a really interesting adult. Not to say that gangly teenagers aren't interesting, but they're still trying to find themselves, and they're sort of halfway between child and adult, and that's what Toronto kind of felt like. And especially over the last 5 years, there is an energy here and a vibrancy here, and a curiosity. Like, there really are spectacular people, and it's such a livable city. I mean, there's obviously challenges too, but it is just such a livable city. And I've been spending a lot of my time since I've come back 5 years ago, I spent a lot of my time in the systems thinking community and the agile community. And there's really, really fascinating people. And I think that's sort of a reflection of Toronto as a whole.
I agree. I don't know what it is about this place, but there's something about it. It seems to bring together some great minds, which is the whole idea behind the show, was to get some of these ideas on tape so that other people could hear it and share it. So I want to thank you for joining me, first of all, but let me ask you, where can people find you and what's next for you?
Best place to find me is on LinkedIn. Like I mentioned, I'm very much in the transition period right now. So I'm really trying to figure out now, how do I really commercialize what I've been working on? And I'm working primarily through LinkedIn. That's sort of my testing, where I'm writing a bunch of articles. But over the next few months, I'll start rolling out a range of different things through LinkedIn and other places as well. So the best place to reach me is on LinkedIn.
And what do you expect is next for you? What do you wish for? Where are you headed?
Yeah, really good question. So I'm hoping to start doing coaching work, and I use coaching not in the traditional coaching sense. It's sort of this quasi-coaching, teaching, facilitating, really just helping people to figure out what do they want to achieve, whether it's individually or in their teams, and really working with them to sort of go through this iterative process of discovering, where can they improve, what are they ready to do, and injecting different approaches than maybe what they normally would think about. And I don't have a traditional coaching approach. It's a little bit different, as we sort of talked about already. So that's really the main thing I'm looking for right now, is to work sort of with teams and or individuals.
I wish you the best with it. I hope this goes great for you. This is, to me, such a fascinating area. And keep us posted so we know how you're coming along and what if you're publishing anything, or if you're online at any point, let me know so we can continue this discussion.
That'd be fantastic.
It's been such a great pleasure talking to you. Now, the bartender says you're cut off. So I'm going to wrap it up for tonight and say it's a real pleasure to meet you. And I want to thank you for spending time with me and sharing some of this deeply important insight. It's been great.
Thanks so much, Chris. I really enjoyed the conversation. You're asking some really good questions, and I really have enjoyed it. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it too. Take care now.
You too. Bye-bye.
Now that was a great conversation. I'm looking forward to learning and reading more, and you should too. You can follow Catarina's work on LinkedIn. Links are in the show notes. And until next time, thank you for joining me, and I'll see you soon.